a new crisis seems to erupt, so there's a lot to talk about. And we felt it was a good idea to create a sort of a short 30-minute format to talk about some of these big changes and news stories that are erupting and what the EU and European policymakers should do about it, under the title Europe Responds. And we thought that there's no better topic to start with than the question of European defense. We sort of put this under the label, can Europe defend itself? To which the answer is, yes, it can, but how? And I think we'll get a bit more into the how and the kind of choices that Europe will have to make in order to get there, with Giuseppe Spatafora, who's our lead analyst on transatlantic relations and who's written a couple of interesting briefs and articles about all these questions. So that's what we're trying to do in the next 30 minutes. Welcome, Giuseppe. We're meeting today, which is a historically significant day. It's not only just after so-called Liberation Day, but we won't get into that this morning. But it's also 76 years to the day that NATO was founded. A bit more contemporarily, it's just the day after the EU defense ministers had their informal meeting in Warsaw, where NATO foreign ministers met in Brussels. So there's a lot of things that are on the plate to talk about this question of European defense. Now, in recent days and weeks, there's been a lot of talk about rearming Europe, on enabling Europe to have the means necessary to defend itself against clearly a world of escalating threats. There are lots of proposals, lots of ideas floating around, but perhaps a good starting point for that conversation is the sort of proposal that the European Commission made just last month, Rearm Europe, which I think came in response to a clearly articulated desire of European leaders that we have to step up on European defense. But why don't you, from your perspective, sort of walk us through a little bit sort of the key components of that strategy, and then we'll get into the implementation challenges around it. But have a start, please, Giuseppe.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure and an honor to start this series with you and to have this excellent conversation. As you can say, there couldn't be a more topical issue to discuss, indeed, because of the meetings that have happened just now as European ministers of defense and also NATO ministerials, as you said. So you asked about the Rearm Europe, and it's good to start with the basics of what it is. Simply put, the way that I see the Rearm Europe plan and connected to that, the white paper that was presented 2 weeks ago, it is, from what I see, an attempt to give a significant set of options to European leaders, member states, and institutions on what to do, because it covers many aspects. The big part of the so-called potential 800 billion euros that could be spent on defense in the next 4 years is about member states spending more, because the European Commission has agreed that member states could activate this escape clause that will remove up to 1.5% of defense spending of a share of GDP for each country from the calculation of the Stability and Growth Pact. So this is basically an incentive for member states to do more, spend more on defense, without it being a problem for other areas, such as debt and deficit calculation. Then there's an element about collective capabilities and doing things together, which is fundamentally the problem of doing things at the European level. And that's where the SAFE instrument as a proposal came in, which is an attempt to basically suggest to European governments to combine in procuring and building capabilities through common European borrowing, basically, or better said, borrowing at European levels with European rates. Then there's an element of simplification, because there's been a lot of discussion of cutting red tape and more specifically making it easier to invest on defense. And there is something called the Defense Omnibus Package, which is another proposal to basically reduce all these all the regulations on defense so that it is easier. And then it's connected to that, the attempt to bring in private capital. And this is especially important because we've seen it with the war in Ukraine and with the general growth of artificial intelligence and emerging and disruptive technologies. Those technologies are fundamental to war fighting. And if we want to be ready to protect ourselves for the attacks of the future, not from the attacks of the past, then we need that. So I see that as a full package, and there's a lot to do. It would be a mistake to just say it's up to member states. It needs to be a collective effort for everyone. But I do think that there are the bases to do something big.
Absolutely. Now, thanks a lot. I think you've captured well, say, the totality of the picture, and we all know we need to work on all these fronts. There's not a silver bullet, but let's start a bit on the money question. So you see around Europe, big packages are being announced, also at the national level. Let's not forget what the Germans are doing and what other member states are doing. I mean, big sums of money are being put on the table. But you and I both know that it's not just a question of money, right? It's also about translating money into actual capabilities. And if we're brutally honest, the history of collective procurement, joint procurement, has not always been as successful as perhaps people would have liked. Defense industries have order books that are very full. If you want to buy missiles today, the companies will say, yes, I have missiles for you in 2035. So how do we solve this problem? You have to turn money into capabilities fast.
That's correct, Stephen. You really hit the hammer with the nail because the nail in the head, because there's really a fundamental issue there that is not just about spending. It's and also, as you said, it's usually defense is a national responsibility at the European level, and therefore a lot of these actions are at national level. And even as we said just now, 650 out of 800 potential billion is national spending that is liberated, let's say, from the Stability and Growth Pact. But there's a risk that it all happens separately at the national level. And that would not help us, because one of the problems that Europe faces is that together we're very strong, but separately there's a lot of small countries, and we are basically face very, very large challenges. You've made some time ago the analogy of the Asterix village. And therefore we need to work together. And indeed, the incentive of procuring collectively need to be put there. And I've already seen some potential questions about whether loans is the way to go, because of course borrowing at the same European rate is good, but there are some countries who are heavily indebted and would want to have more grants. There is another discussion about that could emerge. So what you said, prioritization, it's important. What indeed all stems from what I see is threat assessment. If you believe that a war against Europe is happening in a few years, and there are some intelligence assessments that say that it might be that Russia could be testing NATO Article 5 in a few years' time, then it means that you need to be ready. You need to procure now fast, and you need to focus, as far as I can tell, on things that allow you to do mass, to produce at mass. So there's a lot about ammunition, a lot about fortification, a lot about air defenses that do not necessarily need to be Patriots. Patriots are part of the story, or the European equivalent, SAMP-T and others, but also some cheaper forms of air defense, such as drones. And again, war in Ukraine is an excellent place for that. Then you have to think about the longer term. And the longer term are certain things that you cannot immediately produce. That you still need American assistance for that. But there is an argument to be said that you need a plan in 10 years or so on to replace those with, at least, or have the option to replace them with European alternatives. And that's like we're talking about ISR, especially space-based ISR, Starlink and things like that. You're talking about long-range strikes.
Yes, but Giuseppe, I mean, we don't have oceans of time. These things are super pressing, and the Americans are signaling that they want to get out of the business of, let's say, conventional deterrence in Europe. I mean, it's clear that the Americans are rethinking their posture at the global level. I think we need to move really much faster and a much greater sense of urgency. So just on this question of buying weapons together, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the enormous benefits to be had by buying together in order to drive down the price. Correct. But then there's behind it also a question of, okay, are we going to continue to buy American principally? You and I both know that, the bulk of what Europeans are buying in the defense realm comes from the United States or from other non-EU suppliers? Or do we say, no, I mean, in the current context, you need to prioritize, European industrial capacity, which is lacking, as we mentioned, in order to be in a position that you reduce these strategic dependencies. So is there not an argument for saying, okay, if there is now a rearmament drive in Europe, including at both national, but also at the EU level, different instruments you described, to prioritize the use of those additional funds for building up European capacities, particularly in those areas where we're most dependent on the United States? How do you see that issue?
I see that. I see your point. And of course, there, you mentioned Poland. Poland as one of the, feels one of the most exposed countries. One of the ones that are pushing more for readiness. Is one of those that is pushing to spend most of GDP. But they're the ones signaling, we cannot just buy from across the world because there's nothing in Europe. So we need to buy across from off the shelf and across the world. And what if there is another crisis and those things that we bought, the tanks, the missile, and so on, don't come to us? Or the other side decides to stop supplying it to us. So clearly, security of supply is a fundamental element of all this. And it's essential to the entire endeavor. I think on my side, we need to try to avoid any single point of failure that would block the chain of production, procurement, and import of certain things. So when you say use the European funds for European projects, I agree. And the fact that the SAFE instrument would have a 65% Europe flows is a step in that direction. Of course, then the bulk of the spending will still be done by member states, and there is an argument there to say that both at the intergovernmental level and at the supranational level, this needs to be done at least in coordination. And you should try to do the work.
For sure, we need to get better at coordinating. I mean, we've been working on these issues and talking about these issues for many, many years. The European Defence Agency that has the specific task to help member states get better at these joint procurement projects. And there are many ideas, including in the white paper, to incentivize that more so that member states see the benefit of buying more collectively. But, let's be honest, it's also still being worked out how this SAFE instrument is going to be used, not only Europe versus United States, but also EU versus other Europeans. We have, of course, the UK, we have Norway, Switzerland. So also that is, I think, still something that needs to be worked. What's the right balance between getting kit quickly, because we need to prepare for very tough and a worsening security environment, and perhaps a US withdrawing and so on. We have still the war in Ukraine going on. So there are many demands. We need to move fast, but we don't have the industry yet. So this prioritization question, I think that you mentioned, is going to be really key. I wanted to ask you also a little bit about this idea of, which was not in the white paper, and people noted that, let's say, projects of common priorities. Are there some flagship projects that you can also tell the citizens, you see, this is what European defense is really about? Can you give us some sense of what you expect in June? Because I think it's coming in June, what these common projects could look like. Give us 2 or 3 examples.
Excellent. Yes. So I agree with the idea that some important projects that are high visibility should be indicated to the public, because the question there emerges: why is the EU going to work on defense? Why it's a different thing? It's a different institution, was meant for something else. Obviously, now we know what the rationale behind it is. That you need to protect the single market and the world that we live in and our democratic societies. So there's an argument for that, but still there could be reluctance from that. So when you ask me where can the EU support most, I see 2 things. One, research and development, for the development of complex systems that single countries perhaps cannot do, or even that they may not want to or are unable to spend on. So there's all the elements that relate to development of new technologies and the integration of those, artificial intelligence and so on, and unmanned systems into the defense world. 100% on board with that. Second one is what we call the strategic enablers, which are these major platforms which are there to sort of enable armies to fight. And those are mostly provided by the United States, not only for NATO operations, but also for single country and coalition operations in the immediate European neighborhood. This has been the story. So we're talking a lot about, for instance, these command and control capabilities, or as I said before, ISR, or long-range strikes. These are things, and there is a European project for that, the ELSA, European Long-Range.
I think that's very important. I think we have to demonstrate that in those areas where we now want to invest more, there are also European alternatives. You mentioned satellites, a lot of discussion around Starlink. Are there EU Telsat? Are there other European alternatives? Missile defense, it's clear that in the war in Ukraine, everybody sees the necessity of missile defense, and we know very much also the weaknesses in Europe in that field. But as you indicate, there are some. So bit by bit, you demonstrate that spending on European alternatives can also deliver. I think that's critical, because the more you demonstrate success, the more that people will buy into this notion of spending together, spending at a European level. Okay, listen, let's move a little bit the prism now to NATO. Every day we hear announcements from the United States that their attitudes to NATO is changing. They say also, and we Europeans, we cling very much to every sort of reconfirmation of America's commitment to NATO, and say, no, see, they're still there. And the Secretary General Rutte, he also does that. But from my perspective, I mean, it's obvious that there's a strategic change going on in the US overall posture. We've had also some clear announcements from Defense Secretary Hexet, from Trump himself, and decisions. So we've heard that the defense guidance is changing, and that the US wishes to reduce its role in the conventional deterrence of Europe. We hear about announcement that there's perhaps a change in the posture in the cyber domain vis-a-vis Russia. There is talk of reducing the number of US troops in Europe, and that predates Trump, by the way. So this question of burden sharing is of course an older one, and also under Obama, and even presidents before Obama, we've heard it. So tell me first, what is new about this, and what is old? What is a long-standing American gripe about wishing to get a better burden sharing, and what is something that points to a much more fundamental strategic change that the United States under Trump is implementing? How do you see it?
Yeah, good question. Yes, it's both long-term and new things from Trump 2.0. Long-term, clearly, you already said it, increase defense spending significantly so that the US can look at different theaters. And specifically, they have indicated the challenge of the Indo-Pacific, but also the defense of the continental United States. That has been an emphasis of the administration. And they say, if allies spend more, we don't have to do it. So basically, that's sort of this potential shock therapy, but in reality is a tough rhetoric that reflects this long-term desire for allies to spend more. And to be fair, we're all on board with that. All allies have agreed that they need to spend more, and as you said, they are doing it, or at least are announcing to do it. Then, what is new? The problem there, sometimes it is difficult to separate some of these changes, some of these requests from that you can see a strategic rationale behind it, that you could potentially get on board with, perhaps, if you think that the US is overstretched. But there are other changes in rhetoric that are significant. The fact that there are open threats towards or menaces to other allies, I'm talking about Canada, I'm talking about Denmark when it comes to Greenland, are significant, because they go beyond this issue of defending. Clearly, the US has talked about Greenland in defense terms and security terms, but this does pose questions of territorial integrity of allied countries. So that obviously creates some potential losses of trust, and that basically is at the basis of NATO. In addition to being an integrated command structure, it's an alliance in which allies trust each other on defending each other and on having common security interests. And then there's also, as you said, Russia. the fact that the United States has changed its posture on Ukraine on rhetoric and not only, and it has forced Ukraine to agree to a certain set of measures by withdrawing aid, makes countries wonder whether in the future, as part perhaps of a grand bargain with Russia, it would force other European countries to accept certain reduction in their defense posture because it is threatening to Russia. And that, of course, is speculation, but is no longer outside of the realm of possibility.
No, and I think that this question of trust, I think, is the most important one, because I think Americans, for very good reasons and legitimate arguments, have pushed Europeans for years to do more on defense, and that argument is really compelling. And Europeans have, let's be honest, not always done enough on that score. But now it seems to me, at least, we're in a slightly new game. Where it's not about rebalancing and adjusting the burden sharing to address a common external threat, Russia, maybe China, vis-a-vis the internal workings of the alliance. So NATO was set up to protect ourselves from external enemies. And I think there is now within the NATO alliance, there people all say, okay, but what is the US posture? Not only will they leave us alone facing these external threats, but there is also an element, and I think we have to address this openly, there's an element of uncertainty how the US will threaten maybe allies, and the way in which Trump has spoken about Canada and how the United States has spoken about Greenland has clearly unsettled people, and for good reasons and understandable reasons. Incidentally, I found it quite striking that J.D. Vance, the vice president, went to Greenland and they couldn't find any Greenland local person willing to meet with him, and so he went just to the U.S. military base for in and out visit. Made very derogatory comments about Denmark as an unreliable ally, and just the other day, Prime Minister Frederiksen landed in Nuuk and was hugged by the Greenland Prime Minister, and she's staying there 3 days, and the contrast, I think, was quite stark. But how do you see, is it possible, Giuseppe, to think of a crisis within NATO whereby we have to discuss, the territorial integrity of allies, and how can NATO deal with that? This is a totally new world. So how do you think about that?
Look, it's an excellent question, because of course NATO is for external threats. There have been cases of tensions between allies in the past. I'm thinking of the crisis between Greece and Turkey in the 70s and even earlier. So as an example, and obviously you can think of other cases, the French withdrawal from the integrated military structure and so on. But obviously that's a slightly different thing. But the point is that these crises were strange because they basically blocked the way that NATO works, which is by consensus. But now it is different because it is the biggest country that in the fundamental backbone of the command structure that is making those signals about lack of unity and so on. So this fundamentally, one could say, could there be some sort of constructive abstention by the US and then the alliance continues? Maybe. But of course, first of all, you need to see whether it's just constructive abstention. And second, still, it is all dependent on a US command structure as the backbone on the integrated military structure. And I'm not saying that there is no European and Canada component. It is. And allied armies operate together all the time. And all the discussion that we said before about capability targets and the EU collective development of these capabilities depends on the defense plans and what NATO decides to do. But of course, all this is a question when it comes down to when you say trust, are you willing to share things that are then you think are going to be used by some allies against you? I don't know that if that's the most likely scenario, but it could be in the mind, and I think it is in the mind of many defense planners right now. And perhaps
I think so. I think we are now in an unprecedented situation that you have real political tensions among allies, and among the majority shareholder in NATO is the United States, and there are clear political tensions, and not just on vis-a-vis Canada and Denmark and Greenland, but the whole question of trade war, that the tariffs that have been imposed, very unilateral, very aggressive tariffs, an overall political posture coming from senior members of the administration, which a signal gate also revealed again, have a manner of animosity towards Europeans, because they believe themselves, against the judgment, against the evidence, that the strikes against the Houthis were to bail out Europe, whereas Europe's didn't ask for the Americans to do. But we have this question of ideological and political tensions, and we have this very useful, very important role of NATO as an integrated military command structure with decades of experience of preparing for and running military operations that we want to maintain. So this
Yeah.
incidentally, in my view, will also be relevant for the Ukraine question. There's a lot of talk now these days about Europeans maybe sending some sort of reassurance force, and the logical way to do that will be to still rely on NATO capabilities and assets for that. The US may not send troops, but the best placed people to prepare for that would be sitting at Mons in NATO, and use Berlin Plus arrangements or other such arrangements for that. Do you think that's likely? Will the Americans, quote unquote, allow the use of collective NATO assets for such an operation? How do you see it?
Well, it's a very good question. I don't know if I have an answer to that. It's basically, I do believe that the military command that is based in Europe has become very invested in Ukraine, both in Mons, but also in Wiesbaden and in other places. So they've become very invested in that. The problem is what guidance they will receive from the capital. And while it is possible, you say, from a Berlin Plus arrangement and so on, and things also done informally and very technically, at the end of the day, there's always the possibility that they will be stopped politically. And that depends on what the US and Russia and Ukraine get to agree or not agree on. So I think that will rely also on that, on the continued negotiations and the continuation of the war. And that will probably dictate the extent to which Trump will be willing to continue to allow this. But from the perspective of personnel, I don't doubt that they would want to continue.
I think that's right. Now, listen, I have one last big question for us to end this episode, and it's a gigantic question, but I'm going to put it anyway. I mean, the elephant in the room is, of course, the nuclear question. Europe has lived for decades under the US nuclear umbrella. Yes, the United Kingdom and France also had their nuclear arsenal, but the basic story was that we all lived under the US nuclear umbrella. And you see now a debate in Europe, emerging of, okay, amid all these doubts and changes that we described, should Europe have another fresh look at that? And you heard, for instance, the incoming chancellor in Germany, Friedrich Merz, making comments about this. We were both in Poland, where there's also a discussion around this. But there's always been this question, okay, if you had some sort of European cooperation on nuclear deterrence, how do you organize this politically? I mean, which finger will be on the button? And the French talk about a European dimension to the force de frappe, but there's one finger, and that's the French president. So how do you see that issue?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, then there's potentially a paradox in all this, that even in Project 2025, which is sort of the handbook that has led ideologically the presidential transition, even there, they say that the conventional deterrence in Europe should be scaled down, but the US should maintain a nuclear posture. So even they see that, and I think they see it from a purely cost perspective. But of course, the signals matters the most in nuclear deterrence. And you need to believe that the US will be willing to use those forces, nuclear forces, to protect all the other countries in Europe. So it goes back to the problem of trust, and that's fundamental for deterrence. So that's why the discussion that is happening in Paris, in Berlin, and in Warsaw and beyond is very relevant. Now, when it comes to how it would happen, it's a really good question. I think obviously the two big nuclear countries in Europe and the one EU country with the nuclear capability will want to maintain their independence on that. But it is important, if signals such as that of President Macron saying that the Eastern European allies and their security is central to French security, which basically extends the French nuclear deterrent idea all the way to the eastern flank, is important. What you can do is you can do simple signals, you can do exercises in NATO and outside NATO with the use of, I don't know, Rafale aircraft, if you don't want to rely only on F-35, but aircraft that is capable to carry nuclear warheads. And you can do these things signaling that the other allies are part of this. And I think signaling is essential because you never want to get to the point of nuclear use, but you want to signal to an adversary who has all the time tried to use nuclear red lines that we also have nuclear weapons, and in certain situations we could resort to them.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot. That's a really a tour de force. We've come to the end of our 30 minutes. So thank you a lot, Giuseppe, for walking us through lots of these strategic shifts and strategic choices that Europe will have to make. Thanks to everyone for joining. Do join again in 2 weeks' time when the next edition of Europe Responds will drop. And I'm certain that between today and then a lot of further changes and challenges will emerge. So there will be plenty to go over then. Thanks to everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stephen. Bye.